Hey, what's up guys? Calum or Calum's Fish Tanks, and in today's video I'm going to be giving you guys 5 super helpful tips for your first planted aquarium. So let's get started. So I have 5 super helpful tips for all you beginner aquarists today, and the first one I'm going to be talking about is knowing what kind of plants you are buying. So when you are setting up your first planted tank, you always want to know the names of the plants you are buying. So before you buy them, you can do a quick Google search on the plant so you don't end up wasting your money. You want to make sure you are able to care for the plants you see or you want to get. Do a quick Google search and figure out if they're right for your tank and you think you can take care of them. Tropica has a great system, and it talks about which plants are easy, medium, or difficult to care for. And if you have the name of the plant, you can do a quick search on Tropica's website if they have that plant for sale, and then you can figure out if you think your tank can handle this plant so you don't end up buying a plant that's super hard and you end up killing it. Now if you don't know the name of the plant but you think it's worth the risk, just go for it. Plants with small or needle-like leaves are also usually harder to take care of, as well as plants that have very bright colors like pinks and red. This usually just is a sign that these are harder to take care of and will require CO2, high light, as well as heavy fertilization. So you're going to want to avoid those if you're a beginner. Now this isn't a rule for all of them, it's just generally they are harder to grow. Now for tip number 2, and that is putting your tank onto a schedule. When keeping a planted tank, I always recommend keeping your tank on a schedule. Whether that's doing your water changes every 7 days, having your lighting on a timer, it's just really helpful in a planted tank. So you're currently looking at my 40 breeder, and this tank is on a schedule that I've had it on since I've set up the tank. So I have the lights on for about 8 hours a day. The CO2 turns on an hour before and an hour after. Now beginners, you should probably avoid CO2. That's one of the later tips. I'll talk a bit more about that. But I also have the lighting on the timer. I do water changes every Wednesday, and I alternate my fertilization, and I dose macros 3 days a week. So that's your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and micros, which is everything else, the other 3 days. So I like to keep all my tanks on a schedule just so things are easier to balance out and you can have a more successful planted tank. So I personally think it is very important to keep your tank on a schedule for at least the things you can control, like your lighting, your CO2, your fertilization, but things that you can't control, like the amount of, like your plant growth, like how often you trim those, that's not something I would schedule. It's just all the things you can control to keep your tank kind of in the same cycle, I guess. Tip number 3 is a very, very important tip, and that is to be patient with your planted tank. Everyone wants to have their plants grow super fast. They want to get their tank nice and filled in and have a beautiful looking aquascape. But if you try to move things too fast by putting in too much fertilization, CO2, it could end up really messing up your tank with a bunch of algae and all this stuff, and it could end up slowing your process down. With planted tanks, you shouldn't really be in a rush to get to the end results, right? Because it could mess up your tank a lot, and just don't overdo it on fertilization and all that stuff. Enjoy the journey, don't look forward to the destination only. Enjoy your tank through all the stages, and don't try to rush through them, or else it could end up causing more problems for you. I'm not saying don't fertilize your tank, you definitely should. Just fertilize at a reasonable rate, follow the labels on your fertilizer if you're a beginner. Don't just go crazy and just overdo it, especially if you don't have high light or CO2. Just take your time with your tank and just enjoy the journey, guys. Tip number 4 is to not cheap out on the setup at the beginning. You want to spend the money at the beginning so you don't have to constantly upgrade your system. I would recommend going for as big as a tank as you can, the best light you can afford. Like, for example, the Fluval Fresh Implant 2.0 would be a perfect light because it can raise up so you can grow lots of high-tech plants later on, and then it can dim down so at the beginning when you're just starting you can grow all these easy to grow plants with this dimmable light. So just start off by spending the money so you don't have to constantly be upgrading and then reselling equipment and losing money. So what I'm trying to say is that if fish keeping is something you're passionate about, buy equipment that can scale, things like larger filters and better lights that are dimmable. So as you grow in the hobby, you don't have to sell and rebuy. You can buy stuff at the beginning that scales with you as you get more advanced in the hobby and as you want to do bigger things in your planted tank. So get equipment that scales so you can save money in the long run. Spend that extra $20 or $40 on your light in the beginning so you don't have to rebuy that light later on. Tip number 5 in my final tip is that you do not need CO2 to have a successful planted aquarium. Especially if you are a beginner, I would avoid CO2 for your first planted tank. It's something that can cause a lot of algae problems if you get fluctuating CO2 and takes a bit of experience to dial in, and it's not something I would recommend for a beginner aquarist because you're going to need to get into a lot of dosing and all of these other things that are a bit more advanced for your first planted aquarium. This tank here has no CO2 at all. It's a common misconception that you do need CO2 to have a successful planted tank. All CO2 does is for those harder to grow plants, it just speeds up their growth rate a little. And this tank does have some harder to grow plants. It's just going to grow in a lot slower than if it did have CO2. But that's something I'm perfectly fine with happening. Like, I'd rather not spend the extra money and have the risks of getting algae because of CO2 than just take it slow and grow this tank out. I'm not saying CO2 is a bad thing, I'm just saying as a beginner I would avoid it because it does make your planted tank a bit more maintenance heavy. You're going to have to do fertilization and all that stuff like I mentioned earlier. I would just not recommend it for a beginner, especially on your first planted tank. And now for a bonus tip. Say you want to really try CO2 but don't want to spend the money. A lot of people recommend DIY CO2 and I have to say completely avoid it. DIY CO2, especially if you don't switch it frequently, can cause a lot of problems in your planted tank. The problem with DIY CO2 is that it can't really be controlled because say you have, even if you do have a valve to control how much is coming out, once DIY CO2 starts to die down, which it does very quick, you're going to be getting a lot less in your planted aquarium, and this will cause those fluctuating CO2 parameters that are perfect for blackbeard algae to grow in your aquarium. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This was Calum's Fish Tanks, and I hope those 5 tips really helped you. And if you want more content on beginner planted tanks and for planted tanks at all levels, please consider subscribing. But anyways, this was Calum's Fish Tanks, and peace.